Today we are going to learn about the Goophered Grapevine by African American novelist and short story writer Charles W. Chestnut. It was first published in Atlantic Monthly in 1887. It was the first work by an African American to appear in this prestigious magazine, although at the time the editors were unaware of Chestnut's race. Actually, the story was reprinted in Chestnut's collection of stories, The Conjure Woman, published in 1899. The story is also available in Collected Stories of Charles W. Chestnut, 1992, edited by William L. Andrews. The story is frequently anthologized and is the best known of the dialect stories Chestnut wrote in the early part of his career. These stories, which use a style of language or dialect spoken by African Americans in the South in the mid-19th century, are not only a landmark in African American literature, they also capture life in the South immediately before and after the Civil War. Next comes the autobiography. African American novelist and short story writer Charles W. Chestnut was born on June 20, 1858 in Cleveland, Ohio. He was the first child of Andrew Jackson Chestnut and Anne Maria Sampson, free blacks who had moved north from North Carolina. In 1866, after the Civil War, the family, now with 5 children, moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina. As a boy, Chestnut attended the Howard School and also worked in his father's grocery store. He was only 14 years old when his first story was published in a local newspaper. The following year, he dropped out of school in order to help the family get through hard financial times. Chestnut had shown he was an outstanding student and he was offered a position as a pupil leader at Howard School. This was all the formal education Chestnut ever had, although reading was his favorite pastime and he was assiduous in continuing to educate himself. He taught at various black schools in North Carolina before returning to Fayetteville in 1877 to begin teaching at the new normal school. He married Susan Perry a year later and in 1880 became principal of the school. Lacking promising career opportunities in the South, Chestnut moved to New York in 1883, where he worked as a stenographer and reporter. Later, he moved to Cleveland, where his wife and 3 children joined him in 1884. The following year, he began to study law, and in 1887, he passed the Ohio bar examination with the highest grade in his group. These are the very short intro about the author. Next, we can see about the summary of the short story. Actually, the Goophered Grapevine is set in North Carolina. It is about the grapevine plantation and how does the white people and black people mingle in that place and what are the sufferings in their life. Actually, this is a very interesting story, and so when you read the story's text itself, you can easily understand. But here I have given you a short summary, and in the class, Google Meet or Zoom class, we can look into it in a detailed way. The Goophered Grapevine is set in North Carolina sometime during or soon after the post-Civil War period known as Reconstruction. The story is narrated by John, a white northerner. His wife Annie is in poor health and the doctor advises them to move to a warmer climate. John was at the time engaged in the business of growing grapes in northern Ohio actually. On the advice of a cousin, he decides to investigate the possibility of moving to North Carolina where the climate is more suitable. The land is ideal for grape growing and the land and labor are cheap. At the end of one summer, he and Annie travel south and arrive in a small town called Pettisville. one of the principal towns in the North Carolina. They stay with their cousin who provides them with a horse and buggy to drive around in. Actually, buggy is a small motor vehicle open on the top to move in and around the grapevine plantation. John finds that grape culture has been tried in the area, but as a result of the ravages of war, it had fallen by the wayside. Several times, John visits a plantation that he thinks might be suitable. It used to belong to a man named McAdoo, but has since been mired in disputes between the heirs. It was actually, the land was very much stuck in the mud and it was not used for cultivation for so many years. There had been a vineyard there, but it has fallen into neglect. John feels that if he bought the plantation, he would be able to successfully cultivate grapes, especially the native grape, the Scuppernong. Scuppernong is the name of the native grape which was cultivated there. And one day he takes his wife to see the place, which is about 5 miles out of the town. The plantation, including the buildings, is virtually in ruins. It was completely destroyed. After looking at the vineyard, John and Annie walk back to the yard where they see an old black man sitting on a pine log under an elm tree eating some grapes with great relish. Right? And they sit next to him and John engages him in conversation. The man says he is from a neighboring plantation. John asks him about the vineyard and the man, whose name is Julius, replies that he knows the whole story of the place since he was born and raised there. He also says that he would not advise John to buy it because there are many more reasons behind that. Maybe it is because of his selfishness or something reason behind that. The vineyard is Goophered, he says, by which means that is it is bewitched in some way. He then tells the white couple the story of the vineyard. Goophered here means it was bewitched. Bewitched means, it was cursed by somebody, and so it was called as Goophered. And nobody can buy that land or cultivate in that land only because of that. That is, it was cursed by someone. Nobody has bought that land till now, and it was completely destroyed, and it was virtually in ruin. It was ruined. And it was not in a condition to cultivate any grapes in that place. So, Julius relates that before the Civil War, Mas Dougal McAdoo grew Scuppernong grapes in great quantities, but the problem was the black slaves from miles around, as well as a settlement of free blacks, all loved Scuppernongs and would secretly come to the plantation to pick and eat them. Actually, they placed black slaves to work in their plantation. White people placed black slaves to work in their field, work in their cultivation. So those people who work in their in the grapevine, due to the very delicious taste of that native grape Scuppernong, they usually eat the grapes in the night. So actually this was not liked by the owner of that grapevine yard, or anyone who is the owner of that place, owner of that cultivation. So what happened? Mas Dougal knew what was going on, but despite of his efforts, was unable to catch the man in act of taking the grapes. He knows very well that these people are eating grapes daily at night, but he was unable to catch the man in the act of taking the grapes. And particularly at that time, he was not able to caught them. That's all. So Mas Dougal then developed a plan. Living with the free blacks was a woman named Aunt Peggy. Aunt Peggy, all the black people were afraid of her because they believed her to be a Kanja woman. Kanja is a dialect form of conjure. Conjure, you have seen conjuring movies and all. Conjure means a terrible thing, something, and who has a spiritual personality or something, that is who will appear with some magic powers. a kind of witch. She was a kind of witch who could put curses on things. So one spring, Master Girl went to visit Aunt Peggy, taking with him gifts of chicken, cake, and wine. The next day, Aunt Peggy visited the vineyard. The slave soon realized that she had been hired by Master Girl to gooper the vineyard. So they were ready to understand the situation that Master Girl had made that conjure woman to curse the vineyard, to give some spell to that vineyard. She made up a concoction consisting of scuppernong leaves, seeds, a snake's tooth, a black cat's tail, and other ingredients. She put these in a bottle, filled it with a scuppernong wine, and buried it under a red oak tree in the woods. She told one of the slaves that if anyone ate the scuppernong grapes, they would be dead within a year. After this, the slaves avoided eating the scuppernongs. But a stranger visited, and his coachman, knowing nothing of the gooper, ate as many scuppernongs as he could. That night he was killed, and when the slaves heard the story, they knew that the gooper worked. This belief was reinforced, and when a black child ate some scuppernongs and died the following week also. So that season, Master Girl was very pleased with himself because he made 1,500 gallons of wine for the expenditure of the $10 he paid to Aunt Peggy. That's all. Just he has made lots and lots of 1,500 gallons of wine with lots and lots of profit. The following summer, one of the slaves died, and Master Girl purchased another one. So they usually purchase slaves, that is black people, to work in their field. So in that following summer, one of the slaves died, and Master Girl purchased another one, an old man named Henry, who was still strong enough to do a hard day's work. But the other slaves, flustered by the fact that a slave from a neighboring plantation had escaped and there was a big search going on for him, forgot to tell Henry about the gooper. So they didn't say anything about the spell that was spelled on the grapevine yard. Sure enough, Henry ate some scuppernong grapes. When the others told him about the gooper, he was very much terrified. An overseer gave him some whiskey, and the next day took him to see Aunt Peggy to see if they could have the gooper lifted. That is, if he wanted to take away the gooper from him, because he had eaten some very much of scuppernong grapes. So he was very much terrified that he too will be died. So he wanted to take out that gooper from him. So he went and met Aunt Peggy. Right? And she gave him some medicine that she said would keep the gooper off him until the spring. But when the sap began to rise, he should come to see her again. That is, she had given him some methods to come out of that gooper. That is, in the spring, Henry acquired a ham from somewhere and took it to Aunt Peggy. She told him that when Master Girl began to prune the grapevine, Henry should scrape off the sap and put it on his bald head, that is, on his own bald head. That would keep the gooper away, and Henry would be able to eat as many scuppernongs as he wanted. So this was the condition. Henry did what he was told and was fine all summer. The following spring, what happened? It will be an amazing thing for we to when we read the text. However, as soon as the grapes started to form, something strange happened. Henry who was very bald, he doesn't have any single hair on his head, began to grow hair on his head, and by summer he had more hair than anyone on the plantation, and it was also curly, and it looked like he had a bunch of grapes on his head. It was just looking like that. He first tried to straighten it and then tried keeping it short. But the strangest thing was that Henry also seemed to get very younger. His joints were no longer stiff, and he was more energetic and lively than even the youngest slave. But in the fall, when the grapes had been gathered, the process was reversed. Henry's hair began to straighten and then fall out. Eventually, he was even more bald than he had been before, and his joints got stiff again. Exactly the same thing happened the following spring and fall. Observing what happened to Henry each year, Master Gull, who was a cunning man, came up with an idea for how he could make money out of Henry. Next spring, he took Henry to town and sold him for 1500 to an unsuspecting buyer. In the fall, when Henry lost his vigor, his new owner sent for a doctor, but the doctor could not restore Henry's former strength, although there appeared to be nothing wrong with him. But in the winter, when Henry got rheumatism and appeared about to die, rheumatism is a disease that comes in the joints of the legs and hands. So when he was appeared about to die, Master Gull offered to buy back him for $500, pretending that he was doing the owner a favor. Just he was pretending as if he is a very good man. Master Gull took good care of Henry in the winter, and then when the sap began to rise again in the spring, he took him to a different country and sold him again for $1500. This pattern went on for 5 years or more, and Master Gull made enough money from it to buy another plantation. Then a stranger arrived to the plantation. He was from the north, and after he inspected the plantation, he told Master Gull that he could tell him how to make his grapevines bear twice as many grapes, and that the new wine press he was selling would make more than twice as many gallons of wine. Master Gull believed what the man said and got his slaves to pour a mixture of lime and ashes around the roots of grapevines, as the man instructed. Master Gull followed all the other instructions the man gave. The next spring, Henry's hair grew even more fast and thick. That was unusual, and the Scuppernong vines grew like never before. Master Gull was short-handed and decided not to sell Henry that year. But as soon as the grapes appeared, the leaves withered and the grapes turned yellow. The vineyard was dying because of the bad advice given by the northerner. Henry was affected too. His rheumatism returned and his hair began to fall out. When the big vine where Henry used to get the sap from died, Henry withered and died too. Master Gull was upset about losing his vines and Henry in the same year. It was 3 years before the vineyards were productive again. When the Civil War broke out, Master Gull raised a company and went off to fight, saying he wanted to kill a Yankee for every dollar he had lost because of the bad advice given to him by the Northerner. Yankee is the American Northerner, and he wanted to kill each and every Yankee of that country. But Master Gull was killed in the war, unfortunately. His wife moved away and the plantation had not been cultivated since then. After Julius finishes his story, Annie asks him if it is true. Julius assures her that it is true. He also advises John against buying the plantation since the gooper may still be on it. Nevertheless, John decides to buy the vineyard and it thrives. He cultivates Copernong and other grapes and makes a very good profit selling to the northern markets. He had not noticed any development of the gooper there, although he suspects that his field hands help themselves to the grapes. John also discovers when he buys the plantation that Julius had lived in the cabin on that place for many years, and so only because of that he has said something that John should not buy that land and made some money, and also he had made some money for the product of the neglected grapevines that was found there. John thinks this is why Julius did not want him to buy the property. He adds that he employs Julius as a coachman, and this is more than enough to compensate him for any loss of income that followed the sale of the plantation. That's all is the summary of this story.